Prince William caught a guard leaking info to Camilla's staff. The instant dismissal that followed. The sun was just beginning to rise over the spires of London, casting a soft golden light on the historic buildings that lined the city streets. Inside Kensington Palace, the royal residence hummed with the quiet activity of a morning in motion. Staff moved briskly through the hallways, carrying documents, polishing silverware, and preparing the rooms for the day ahead. Outside, the city was waking, but inside the palace, there was a sense of calm efficiency, a rhythm honed over centuries of royal tradition. Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, walked through the palace corridors, his mind already occupied with the pressing matters of the day. Even though he had grown up surrounded by royalty and its routines, the responsibilities he now carried were immense. Each decision, each conversation, and each interaction carried weight. William had always taken his duties seriously. He knew that life in the royal household was not just about attending ceremonies or wearing a crown. It was about managing a complex web of people, schedules, and sensitive information. The palace staff worked hard to maintain order, but William knew that even the smallest slip could have significant consequences. Rumors traveled quickly in the corridors, and word of confidential matters could reach the public if one person failed to uphold discretion. He had seen it happen before in other parts of the royal circle. A seemingly harmless comment or an unintended leak could spiral into a story that dominated headlines for weeks. The stakes were high, and William felt the pressure every single day. On this particular morning, William's schedule was unusually packed. Meetings with senior staff, briefings on charitable projects, and a series of calls with government officials all demanded his attention. Yet amid the flurry of official duties, he couldn't shake a growing unease. There had been subtle signs lately, small inconsistencies in communications, details appearing in the wrong hands, messages that seemed to travel faster than they should. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence or human error, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at him like a quiet whisper he could not ignore. He paused in one of the long corridors, framed by portraits of ancestors whose expressions seemed stern yet wise. The walls, painted in soft cream tones, carried a sense of history that both comforted and reminded him of the responsibility he bore. Here, every action mattered, and the legacy of the monarchy was not something to take lightly. William often thought about his father, King Charles III, and the lessons he had learned growing up under public scrutiny. Duty, loyalty, and discretion were not just words, they were principles to live by. As he continued walking, William reflected on the trust that underpinned the palace. Each member of the staff, from the most senior aide to the newest recruit, played a vital role in maintaining the smooth functioning of the household. Trust was the glue that held the system together. Without it, the entire operation could crumble. The more he considered the recent anomalies in communications, the more concerned he became. In a place where appearances mattered just as much as actions, even a minor breach of trust could cause ripple effects that reached far beyond the palace walls. He entered the main office, where aides were busy reviewing schedules and coordinating events. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, an oddly comforting scent amid the intensity of palace life. William took his seat behind the large oak desk, surrounded by neatly stacked documents and digital screens displaying upcoming engagements. He began reviewing the morning briefings, his eyes scanning for any discrepancies or urgent matters. Everything appeared routine at first glance, but he knew better than to take appearances at face value. William's mind wandered to the charitable initiatives he was passionate about, the mental health programs, the environmental projects, and the community outreach efforts. These were the parts of his life that grounded him, the work that made the long hours and constant scrutiny feel meaningful. Yet, even in these moments of reflection, he could not ignore the tension that had been building. Something was off, and he felt a responsibility to find out what it was before it became a bigger problem. The palace staff moved around him efficiently, but he noticed one detail that made him pause. A minor memo, intended for a limited number of people, seemed to have been referenced elsewhere in a way that raised questions. William's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered the implications. He had been taught to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that someone within the household might be sharing information they shouldn't. The thought made him uneasy, not just because of the potential embarrassment, but because of the betrayal of trust it represented. In a place built on loyalty and discretion, any breach could undermine the foundation of the entire household. Determined to address the issue, William decided to start with subtle observation. He would watch the flow of information, noting who had access to certain documents and who seemed unusually well-informed. This approach required patience and careful attention, skills he had developed over years of royal training and personal experience. He understood that confronting the issue prematurely could cause unnecessary tension or even alert the person responsible. Strategy and timing were key. As the morning progressed, William continued his rounds, moving from office to office, greeting staff with a polite nod or a brief smile. Despite his internal concerns, he maintained the composed demeanor expected of a royal. People often underestimated the pressure that came with such a role, the constant balancing of personal feelings with public expectations, the need to project calm and authority even when uncertainty lingered. He had learned to mask his worry with courtesy, a skill that had saved him from many potentially awkward situations. By late morning, the tension in the palace had grown almost imperceptibly, like the quiet before a storm. William could feel it in the way aides glanced at one another, in the hushed tone of conversations, and in the slight hesitations of staff moving through the hallways. The palace was alive with routine, yet beneath it, a subtle sense of unease had taken hold. It was not something that could be ignored, and William knew that he needed to act, but he also knew that he had to be careful. Every step he took now would determine how smoothly the issue could be resolved. Sitting back at his desk, William reviewed the memos and communications again. He compared timestamps, cross-checked recipients, and noted patterns that didn't align with the usual flow of information. Each small detail added to a growing picture, one that pointed to a breach of trust somewhere within the palace walls. The realization weighed heavily on him. In a household that relied on discretion and loyalty, even one person acting against protocol could cause chaos. For William, this was not just a matter of professional duty, it was personal. He valued honesty and integrity above all else and expected the same from those around him. The thought that someone he had trusted might be undermining the palace's operations was deeply unsettling. Yet he also recognized the importance of handling the matter with care. Accusations without evidence could create unnecessary tension, but ignoring the signs could lead to far greater problems. He needed to find a balance between caution and action. By noon, William had gathered enough observations to confirm his suspicions. Something was indeed amiss, but identifying the specific person responsible required further investigation. He planned to proceed methodically, observing interactions and monitoring communications, all while maintaining the usual flow of palace life. To the casual observer, everything seemed normal, but beneath the surface, a quiet detective work was underway. William understood that his role was not just to react, but to anticipate, to prevent problems before they escalated. As he prepared for the next round of meetings, William allowed himself a brief moment to reflect on the weight of responsibility. Being part of the royal family was more than ceremonial. It was about stewardship, trust, and accountability. Every decision had consequences, and every action sent ripples through the household and beyond. The awareness of this responsibility sharpened his focus, reinforcing the need for vigilance and discernment. And so, the day continued at Kensington Palace, with its blend of tradition, protocol, and quiet tension. Staff carried out their duties, unaware that their prince was watching closely, piecing together clues to ensure the smooth functioning of the household. William moved among them with calm authority, a figure of composure amid the subtle undercurrents of uncertainty. The morning light streamed through the palace windows, illuminating the ornate hallways and casting a golden glow on the centuries of history contained within. In that quiet, controlled environment, Prince William prepared himself for the challenge ahead, determined to uphold the principles of trust, loyalty, and discretion that defined both his role and his character. Prince William's suspicion about the palace leak grew stronger as the morning wore on. While the halls of Kensington Palace continued their usual rhythm, he noticed subtle patterns that did not fit the ordinary flow of information. Little details that would normally go unnoticed suddenly stood out. A message meant for a single aide seemed to reach unintended ears almost immediately. A schedule change, carefully planned, appeared to have been anticipated by someone who shouldn't have known about it. These small anomalies added up, creating a sense of unease in William's mind. He moved through the palace, observing staff with a careful eye. Everyone seemed devoted and diligent, yet even the most dedicated employees could unintentionally pass on information. William knew he had to separate mistakes from deliberate actions. Loyalty, after all, was the foundation of the royal household. One act of betrayal could erode the trust that had been built over years of service. He recalled lessons from his father, King Charles III, about discretion and responsibility. Every member of the household had a role, and the smooth functioning of the palace depended on each person respecting their responsibilities. The prince's first step was to observe interactions quietly. He began paying attention to subtle behavior patterns, who lingered a little too long near certain offices, who asked questions that seemed out of place, and who appeared unusually aware of confidential matters. While some of these actions might have innocent explanations, William trusted his instincts. Something was different, and he was determined to uncover it. He could not afford to let this uncertainty disrupt the household's harmony or compromise its reputation. As the day progressed, William made discreet inquiries with senior staff, careful not to raise alarms. He asked about communication procedures, how information was shared, and whether anyone had noticed unusual behavior. Answers were routine, polite, and seemingly honest, but the prince sensed that not everything was being revealed. Perhaps the person responsible was clever, careful, or simply bold. Either way, William knew that the situation required a combination of observation and strategy. He could not act hastily, but neither could he ignore the warning signs. One particularly curious detail caught his attention. A recent memo about a private engagement had been read by someone outside the immediate circle of recipients. The memo contained information meant strictly for a select few, yet somehow it had reached another office where it did not belong. William's brow furrowed as he considered how this could have happened. Was it a mistake, a careless staff member, or an intentional act? The more he examined the flow of information, the more convinced he became that someone was deliberately sharing details. He decided to take a step further. Using his access, he began reviewing records of communication within the household. He checked who received which messages, who opened them, and whether any unusual patterns emerged. It was painstaking work, requiring patience and focus. Yet William knew that attention to detail was essential. Even a small error could give away the identity of the person responsible. The process was slow, but it provided a clearer picture of the palace's internal communications, revealing minor inconsistencies that would otherwise have been invisible. Meanwhile, life in the palace went on as usual. Meetings were held, tea was served, and visitors were greeted with courtesy. Staff moved with efficiency and care, unaware that their prince was monitoring subtle details behind the scenes. William appreciated their dedication, knowing that most were loyal and hardworking. Still, he could not ignore the evidence that pointed to a breach of trust. A palace depended on reliability and discretion, and even one lapse could create far-reaching problems. William began to notice patterns in the interactions of certain staff members. Some seemed unusually curious about matters outside their immediate duties. Others were overly attentive to conversations or documents they had no need to see. These behaviors, while not overtly suspicious, were enough to make the prince cautious. He decided to pay closer attention, observing them quietly over several days to determine whether their actions were consistent with normal curiosity or part of something more deliberate. He also reflected on the pressures faced by staff members. Working in a royal household could be challenging, with expectations of perfection, discretion, and attentiveness. Mistakes were sometimes inevitable, and even loyal employees could make errors. William considered whether the leak could be an accident rather than a betrayal. He reminded himself to remain fair, gathering facts before passing judgment. Patience and careful observation would reveal the truth. As the afternoon sun poured through the palace windows, William called a small meeting with senior aides. He asked them to review recent communications and note any unusual occurrences. He emphasized the importance of confidentiality while remaining calm and composed. His approach was firm but not accusatory, reflecting his belief that solving the problem required strategy, not confrontation. The aides nodded in agreement, understanding the seriousness of the situation and the prince's expectations. While reviewing reports with his aides, William noticed another anomaly. A staff member had been present in areas they normally had no reason to visit. Small details, like which doors they entered or how long they lingered in certain rooms, suggested more than innocent curiosity. William's attention to these details was meticulous. He knew that in such a structured environment, even minor deviations could indicate something larger. By evening, the prince had compiled a substantial amount of evidence pointing to a potential leak. He reflected on the implications. The palace operated on trust, discretion, and loyalty. Any breach of these principles could disrupt operations and harm the reputation of the royal household. He felt a mix of concern and determination. The matter could not be ignored, but neither could it be addressed without careful planning. Acting hastily could cause unnecessary conflict or falsely accuse an innocent person. To ensure accuracy, William decided to observe staff during the next day's activities. He would note behavior patterns, interactions, and reactions to information. He also planned to monitor communications discreetly, comparing intended recipients with actual outcomes. His methodical approach reflected his understanding that careful preparation was key to resolving sensitive matters. Patience and attention to detail would reveal the truth without creating unnecessary tension. William also considered the human element. The palace was home to hundreds of staff members, each with their own personality, motivations, and responsibilities. It was possible that the leak, if intentional, was driven by a misunderstanding, loyalty to the wrong person, or even ambition. Understanding the context was as important as identifying the individual. William approached the situation with empathy, aware that not every action stemmed from malice. Late in the evening, after a long day of observation and reflection, William walked through the quiet palace corridors. The rooms, bathed in soft light, carried the calm of routine, yet beneath it, the prince's mind was alert. He thought about the principles that guided his actions: integrity, trust, and responsibility. The palace's smooth functioning depended on these values. He also considered the broader impact of any breach, knowing that even a small act of disloyalty could ripple through the household and beyond. He paused in front of a large portrait of King George VI, a reminder of the lineage of responsibility that he carried. Royal life was demanding, often requiring difficult decisions and careful navigation of complex situations. William reflected on the lessons he had learned from his parents, his experiences, and his own observations. The ability to act wisely and with discretion was essential, especially in matters of trust. As the night settled over Kensington Palace, William prepared a plan for the following day. He would continue discreet observation, gather further evidence, and maintain the palace's daily operations without disruption. He knew the situation required patience, diligence, and a careful balance between caution and action. One wrong move could create tension, while inaction could allow the breach to continue. The responsibility weighed heavily, but he accepted it fully, understanding that leadership often required difficult decisions. With the palace quiet and the staff winding down for the evening, William finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He understood the stakes. Loyalty and trust were the backbone of the royal household, and any disruption could have far-reaching consequences. The careful, deliberate work he had started that morning was only the beginning. The coming days would reveal whether the anomaly was a minor mistake or something more deliberate. Either way, William was prepared to address it, confident in his approach and determined to protect the integrity of the palace. And so, the day ended as it began, with the palace appearing calm and orderly, while beneath the surface, a quiet investigation was underway. Prince William's focus, patience, and determination ensured that the household's operations would continue smoothly, even as he sought to uncover the truth. The tension remained subtle but palpable, a quiet current beneath the polished surfaces of Kensington Palace. It was a reminder that in a place built on trust, vigilance was never optional. The next morning, Kensington Palace woke to its usual rhythm, with sunlight spilling through the tall windows and staff moving quietly through the corridors. Prince William, however, entered the day with a sharper focus than ever. Overnight, he had reviewed every detail from the previous days, from memos and schedules to staff movement and minor behavioral patterns. Every anomaly was now a piece of a larger puzzle, and he was determined to find the missing pieces. The leak had to be identified, not just for the sake of palace security, but for the trust and integrity of everyone who worked there. William began his day with a review of the morning reports. He studied the communications logs carefully, noting timestamps, recipients, and responses. Some messages had been opened almost immediately after being sent, which in itself was not unusual. But others had triggered responses from individuals who had no legitimate reason to receive the information. The more William analyzed, the more the evidence pointed toward deliberate action. This was no longer just a minor concern. It was a serious matter that required careful, decisive handling. He walked through the palace, observing staff quietly, blending into the background as he had learned to do over years of experience. His eyes scanned hallways, offices, and common areas, noting who lingered near sensitive information, who appeared overly curious, and who seemed unusually aware of matters outside their responsibilities. Every glance, every movement, and every interaction was catalogued in his mind. Patience was key, he reminded himself. Rushing could alert the person responsible or create unnecessary tension among loyal staff. In the afternoons, William held routine meetings, but his attention was divided. While he discussed charitable initiatives, community outreach, and palace events with his aides, his mind returned repeatedly to the anomalies he had noticed. He recalled moments when a document had moved faster than it should, when a schedule change had been anticipated, and when a staff member's questions hinted at knowledge they shouldn't possess. These small incidents, taken individually, could be explained away. But together they formed a troubling pattern. By mid-afternoon, William began focusing on one particular area, the inner security and communication channels of the palace. The staff had been loyal for years, and most were highly trustworthy, but one inconsistency stood out. A guard assigned to routine security duties seemed unusually informed about matters that were not part of his responsibilities. The guard was polite, professional, and well-liked, which made the possibility of wrongdoing even more surprising. Yet the evidence was compelling. William knew he had to observe this individual more closely. He arranged for discreet monitoring of communications and movements within the palace. This was done in a subtle way, without creating discomfort or suspicion among staff. William knew that the best approach was to gather facts, not rumors. He wanted to be certain before confronting anyone, especially in such a sensitive environment. Royal life demanded caution. Accusations without proof could harm innocent individuals and damage morale within the household. As the hours passed, William's observations became more detailed. He noted small behaviors that seemed out of place. A guard lingering near offices where he had no reason to be, listening carefully to conversations, and occasionally taking notes or messages that did not pertain to his duties. The guard's actions were not overtly suspicious, but when combined with the communication anomalies, they painted a concerning picture. William's instincts, honed over years of responsibility, told him this was a serious matter. At the same time, William considered the context. Guards and staff often moved quickly and interacted with multiple departments, which could explain some coincidences. Yet, the pattern was too consistent to be accidental. He reviewed previous days' schedules, noting where information had traveled and which individuals had been present at key moments. The guards' presence in these locations aligned with the unusual spread of confidential information. It was subtle, but deliberate observation revealed the connections. William also spoke with a few trusted senior aides, carefully framing his questions to avoid raising suspicion. He asked about protocol, recent anomalies, and whether anyone had noticed irregular behavior. Their responses were polite and routine, but their reactions provided subtle clues. Some aides seemed slightly hesitant, while others appeared confident and straightforward. This further reinforced William's belief that careful monitoring and evidence collection were necessary before taking action. Late in the afternoon, William decided to test the guard indirectly. He assigned a small task that involved confidential information, sharing it only with the guard and observing what happened next. The task was harmless in itself, but it allowed William to see how the guard handled sensitive details. Within hours, the information had reached unintended parties, a clear confirmation of William's suspicions. The evidence was undeniable. Someone within the palace had been sharing information, and the guards' involvement was now clear. Despite the tension, William remained calm. He knew that reacting impulsively could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Instead, he carefully documented every detail, ensuring that there was a clear record of the guards' actions. This methodical approach reflected William's commitment to fairness and precision. In a royal household, it was not enough to suspect wrongdoing. Proof was essential before confronting any individual. As the evening approached, William gathered the final pieces of the puzzle. He reviewed communications logs, observed interactions, and cross-referenced his notes with schedules and tasks. The pattern was consistent. The guard had accessed information outside of his responsibilities and had passed it along to staff members who should not have received it. The realization was disappointing, yet necessary. In a household that depended on trust, such a breach could not be ignored. William reflected on the significance of this discovery. The palace operated on a foundation of loyalty and discretion. Every staff member, from the newest recruit to the most senior aide, had a role to play in maintaining that trust. The guard had violated that foundation, creating risk for the household's operations and reputation. For William, this was more than a procedural matter. It was a test of leadership, judgment, and responsibility. He also considered the human side of the situation. The guard had been polite, professional, and seemingly loyal. It was possible that ambition, misunderstanding, or misplaced loyalty had motivated the behavior. Understanding the why was as important as addressing the what. William knew that confronting the situation with composure and fairness would be essential, both for the individual involved and for the morale of the rest of the staff. To ensure the process was handled correctly, William prepared a careful plan. The first step was to gather all evidence in a clear and organized way. The second was to ensure that the confrontation, when it happened, would be private, respectful, and direct. The goal was not to humiliate or punish unnecessarily, but to protect the integrity of the palace and uphold the principles of loyalty and discretion that governed it. That night, William walked through the palace quietly. The hallways, usually filled with the sounds of activity, were calm and empty. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch over him, a reminder of the responsibility carried by generations of royals before him. He reflected on the delicate balance of authority, trust, and leadership that defined his role. The palace was a place of tradition and routine, yet it also required vigilance and discernment. One misstep could create ripple effects far beyond the palace walls. William's thoughts turned to the upcoming confrontation. He knew it had to be handled with care. The guard would be given the opportunity to explain, and the situation would be assessed fairly. At the same time, he recognized the importance of decisive action. A breach of trust, no matter how small, could not be overlooked. The palace depended on everyone respecting their roles, and William was determined to protect that structure. As the night deepened, the prince reviewed his notes one last time. Every observation, every detail, and every piece of evidence had been carefully recorded. The pattern was clear, and the conclusion unavoidable. The guard had been passing information to others within the household, creating a risk that could not be ignored. William felt a mix of disappointment and resolve, knowing that the next steps would be challenging but necessary. In the quiet of Kensington Palace, the stage was set for the resolution. William's careful observation and methodical approach had revealed the truth. The tension of the past few days had built to this moment, a turning point that would test not only the loyalty of a single individual, but also the stability and integrity of the household as a whole. The prince was prepared to act, balancing fairness, discretion, and authority in a way that reflected both his character and his responsibilities. And so, as the palace settled into the night, William's mind was focused and clear. The investigation had reached its peak, the evidence was undeniable, and the path forward was certain. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, accountability, and the restoration of trust. For now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, aware that leadership often required difficult decisions, careful observation, and unwavering integrity. The palace appeared calm, yet beneath the surface, the story of loyalty, vigilance, and responsibility was reaching its most critical moment. The next morning in Kensington Palace began like any other, with the soft light of dawn spilling over the historic buildings and the palace. Staff moving through their routines. But for Prince William, the day was anything but ordinary. Overnight, he had reviewed all the evidence collected over several days, the anomalies in communication, the unusual behaviors, and the movements of staff members. All signs pointed to one person, a guard who had been entrusted with responsibility and discretion but had betrayed that trust. The prince knew that the next step required courage, tact, and clarity. William started his morning quietly, meeting briefly with his senior aides. He explained that he had gathered enough evidence to address a serious breach of trust. The aides, who had been loyal and observant, understood immediately the gravity of the situation. They offered support but remained discreet, understanding that the confrontation must be private and handled with care. William's approach was calm but firm, a reflection of his belief that leadership involved responsibility and fairness, not anger or spectacle. He then reviewed the guard's schedule, noting his duties, his usual routine, and the times when the breaches had occurred. Every detail mattered, and William's meticulous preparation reflected his understanding of the delicate nature of palace life. The guard had served in the household for years, and despite the current situation, William recognized the complexity of confronting someone who was both trusted and skilled in their duties. It was not just about punishment. It was about protecting the integrity of the palace and sending a clear message about the importance of loyalty and discretion. When the time came, William summoned the guard to a private room. The space was simple, yet dignified, a neutral setting designed to focus on conversation rather than intimidation. The guard entered, polite and composed, unaware that the prince already had a full understanding of the events that had taken place. William greeted him calmly, maintaining the composed demeanor expected of a royal, while the guard, trusting the normalcy of the situation, responded with respect. William began by stating the facts clearly and calmly. He explained that there had been unusual patterns in communications and movements, patterns that had been carefully observed and documented over several days. He outlined the specific incidents, referencing memos, tasks, and interactions that had raised concerns. Throughout the explanation, William's tone remained neutral, professional, and firm. He was focused on clarity, ensuring that the guard understood the seriousness of the situation without unnecessary dramatization. The guard listened attentively, his expression shifting slightly as the details unfolded. At first, there was a sense of disbelief, as if the implications had not fully registered. But as William continued, calmly presenting the evidence, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The guard had been entrusted with responsibility, yet the actions had breached trust and protocol. William emphasized that loyalty and discretion were not optional in the palace, they were essential. Every member of the household depended on them, and even a single lapse could have far-reaching consequences. After presenting the evidence, William allowed the guard to respond. This moment was critical. The guard had the opportunity to explain, clarify, or provide context. But the explanation was insufficient, failing to address the key points of the observed behavior. William listened carefully, maintaining his composure, aware that fairness required hearing the other side while also recognizing that the documented actions spoke for themselves. The principles of accountability, integrity, and responsibility were at the forefront of his mind. With the facts clear and the response noted, William delivered his decision. The breach of trust could not be overlooked, and the guard would be dismissed from service immediately. The tone was firm, yet respectful. There was no anger, no public embarrassment, just a clear, decisive action to protect the palace and uphold the standards expected of every member of the household. The dismissal was swift, reflecting both the seriousness of the breach and the need to maintain order and integrity within the palace. The guard acknowledged the decision with quiet professionalism. While the situation was undoubtedly difficult, the orderly and respectful handling ensured that the process maintained dignity for all involved. William's approach underscored a critical principle. Consequences were necessary, but they could be delivered without hostility or humiliation. The message was clear: loyalty and discretion were paramount, and breaches, no matter how unexpected or shocking, would be addressed responsibly. Following the dismissal, William documented the outcome meticulously. Every step from observation to evidence gathering to the final decision was recorded. This documentation was important not only for accountability, but also for future reference, ensuring transparency and clarity in palace operations. By maintaining a detailed record, William demonstrated the importance of fairness, responsibility, and principled leadership. Word of the incident, of course, remained contained within the palace. Staff were aware that action had been taken, but the details were discreet, preserving the dignity of all involved and preventing unnecessary disruption. William's careful handling ensured that the household's morale remained intact, while reinforcing the critical values of trust and discretion. The staff understood that loyalty and integrity were not abstract ideals, they were practical requirements for the smooth functioning of the palace. As the day continued, William reflected on the events. The process had been challenging, requiring patience, observation, and careful judgment. But it had also been a confirmation of the importance of vigilance in leadership. In a household as complex as a royal residence, even small breaches could have significant consequences. By addressing the issue directly and responsibly, William not only protected the palace's operations, but also reinforced the values that underpinned the institution. He also thought about the broader lessons. Leadership, he realized, was often tested not in grand ceremonies or public appearances, but in moments of quiet decision-making, in situations where trust was betrayed and difficult choices had to be made. The incident had been a test of both judgment and character, and it had reaffirmed William's commitment to fairness, integrity, and principled action. These values were not merely personal, they were essential for the stability and reputation of the household. Even as evening approached, the palace continued its routine. Staff moved efficiently through their tasks, aware that the prince had handled a serious matter, but reassured by the calm and respectful manner of his approach. William's example reinforced the culture of professionalism, loyalty, and responsibility within the household. The incident, while challenging, had become an opportunity to strengthen the standards expected of every member of the palace. As night fell, William took a quiet walk through the palace corridors. The portraits of past monarchs, framed in golden light, seemed to watch over him, a reminder of the legacy of responsibility that came with royal life. He thought about the trust that had been broken, the careful observation that had led to the truth, and the decisive action that had restored order. Leadership, he reflected, required courage, patience, and a commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult. By the end of the day, the palace had regained its calm. The breach had been addressed, the responsible party held accountable, and the household reminded of the importance of loyalty and discretion. William felt a quiet satisfaction, not in the act of dismissal itself, but in the knowledge that the palace's integrity had been preserved. The careful, principled handling of the situation reflected the values he hoped to uphold, ensuring that the household could continue to function smoothly and effectively. That night, as the palace settled into silence, William reviewed the events once more. The confrontation had been difficult but necessary. The guard's dismissal, while immediate, had been handled with respect and fairness. The evidence was clear, the actions decisive, and the message unmistakable. Loyalty and discretion were non-negotiable in the royal household. William understood that such moments were a part of leadership, a reminder that vigilance, responsibility, and integrity were essential for the proper functioning of the palace. The palace itself seemed to breathe a quiet sigh of relief. Normal routines resumed, yet the lessons of the day remained. Staff were reminded through example rather than words alone that their roles carried weight, responsibility, and the expectation of unwavering trust. William's careful handling of the situation reinforced these values while maintaining dignity and respect for everyone involved. The balance between accountability and fairness had been maintained, a reflection of thoughtful leadership in action. And so, with the incident resolved, William allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The palace was calm, the household secure, and the breach of trust addressed. Leadership, he knew, was often tested in such moments, through careful observation, thoughtful judgment, and principled action. The day had been challenging, yet it had reaffirmed the importance of trust, integrity, and responsibility. Prince William's decisive but respectful handling of the situation ensured that the palace would continue to operate smoothly, guided by the principles that had long defined the royal household. The day after the dismissal, Kensington Palace was quiet but filled with a subtle sense of order and purpose. Life within the historic walls had returned to its usual rhythm, yet the events of the previous days had left a lasting impression on everyone. Staff members moved efficiently through the corridors, carrying out their duties with renewed focus, aware that the standards of loyalty and discretion were being reinforced not through fear, but through example. Prince William walked through the palace with a calm, thoughtful demeanor, observing the day-to-day operations and reflecting on the lessons learned from the recent breach. For William, the dismissal had been a necessary but difficult decision. The guard had served faithfully in the household for years, and the decision to remove him weighed heavily. Yet, in his role as a leader, William understood that accountability was essential. Leadership was not simply about guiding and supporting. It also required making difficult decisions when trust was compromised. The palace depended on every member respecting their responsibilities, and the incident had highlighted how vital it was to uphold these principles consistently. The prince began the morning by meeting with his senior aides to discuss the impact of the dismissal and the measures needed to prevent similar situations in the future. They reviewed communication protocols, staff responsibilities, and monitoring procedures, ensuring that the household would be better equipped to maintain confidentiality. William emphasized the importance of transparency and clarity while balancing discretion. His approach was calm, collaborative, and constructive, demonstrating that accountability did not need to come at the expense of morale. Throughout the day, William also engaged with staff personally. He walked through the hallways, stopping to greet employees and offer encouragement. The atmosphere was noticeably positive. Staff members were reassured that the breach had been addressed with fairness and integrity. By taking time to connect with the household, William reinforced trust and reminded everyone that their contributions were valued. He knew that a royal household functioned best when employees felt respected, understood, and motivated. In addition to restoring morale, William considered the broader lessons for leadership and trust. He reflected on the importance of vigilance, careful observation, and proactive measures. A single breach of trust had the potential to disrupt operations, but by addressing it decisively and respectfully, he had not only resolved the immediate issue, but also strengthened the foundation of the palace's culture. Leadership, he realized, was often defined by the ability to balance firmness with fairness, vigilance with empathy, and accountability with encouragement. To reinforce the lessons, William introduced subtle procedural changes. Communication channels were reviewed, with clearer guidelines on the flow of information and responsibilities of staff members. Training sessions were planned to emphasize discretion and professionalism, ensuring that every employee understood the importance of loyalty within the household. These changes were implemented not as punishment, but as reinforcement of values that were already central to the palace's operation. The approach reflected William's commitment to proactive leadership, prevention, education, and reinforcement rather than reaction alone. As the day progressed, William took time to consider the emotional and psychological impact of the events on himself and the staff. Leadership, he realized, involved managing both operational and human factors. Staff members were capable and loyal, but even in the most disciplined households, mistakes or lapses could occur. By addressing the situation with fairness and transparency, William had not only corrected the breach, but also strengthened the bonds of trust and loyalty among the remaining team. Morale improved, and a sense of collective responsibility was reinforced. He also reflected on the personal aspects of the experience. The responsibility of overseeing a royal household was immense, requiring constant attention to detail, observation of human behavior, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. Each day brought challenges that demanded both strategic thinking and empathy. The incident with the guard had tested these skills, highlighting the delicate balance required in leadership. William understood that the effectiveness of his decisions depended not only on his judgment, but also on the way he engaged with and supported his staff. In the quiet moments of the afternoon, William walked through the palace gardens. The fresh air and greenery offered a moment of reflection away from the routines and responsibilities inside. He considered the importance of cultivating an environment where staff could thrive, while understanding the significance of trust and discretion. The palace was more than a residence. It was a community built on shared values, and maintaining harmony required constant care and attention. The recent events had reinforced his appreciation for this delicate balance. William also considered the broader impact of the incident. While the situation had been contained, the lessons extended beyond the palace walls. Leadership, accountability, and integrity were principles that applied in every aspect of life, whether in public service, charitable work, or personal conduct. By handling the situation responsibly, William had demonstrated these principles not only to his staff, but also as an example to the wider public. The careful management of sensitive matters reflected the values that he hoped to uphold throughout his life. Throughout the day, William engaged in reflective conversations with trusted aides, discussing how similar situations could be prevented in the future. They brainstormed practical strategies, such as enhanced monitoring of sensitive information, clearer delineation of responsibilities, and routine reviews of protocols. These discussions were collaborative, with William emphasizing the importance of learning from the experience rather than simply punishing mistakes. The focus was on improvement, reinforcement, and the ongoing cultivation of a trustworthy and efficient household. Evening fell over Kensington Palace, casting long shadows through the corridors and bathing the historic rooms in a warm glow. William took a final walk through the halls, observing staff as they concluded their day. The atmosphere was calm, orderly, and respectful. The recent disruption, though significant, had been resolved without lingering tension or uncertainty. Staff members were reassured that the household's integrity had been maintained, and the prince's careful, principled handling had strengthened trust rather than undermining it. In private, William reflected on the personal lessons of the incident. Leadership was not only about addressing problems, but also about anticipating potential issues, observing carefully, and acting decisively when necessary. The experience had reinforced his belief in patience, fairness, and clear communication. By balancing firmness with empathy, he had been able to correct the breach, restore trust, and reinforce the values that were central to the royal household. He also considered the importance of example. Every action taken by a leader sets a standard for others to follow. By handling the guard's dismissal respectfully and decisively, William demonstrated that accountability and integrity were not negotiable, but they could be upheld in a dignified and constructive manner. The staff, observing his approach, understood that the principles of loyalty, discretion, and responsibility applied to everyone equally. Throughout the night, the palace settled into its customary quiet. William's reflections encompassed both the operational and personal dimensions of leadership. He thought about the interconnectedness of trust, accountability, and morale, recognizing that each element supported the others. The recent incident, while challenging, had ultimately reinforced the resilience of the household. Staff members were reminded of their responsibilities, the importance of discretion, and the value of integrity in maintaining the palace's smooth functioning. By the end of the week, the palace had fully returned to its normal rhythm. Staff carried out their duties with confidence, reassured that the household was secure and that leadership was both vigilant and fair. William's careful handling of the situation had preserved harmony, strengthened trust, and reinforced the standards expected of everyone. The lessons learned extended beyond the immediate incident, shaping future operations and cultivating a culture of responsibility and professionalism. In quiet moments, William reflected on the broader implications of the experience. Trust, he realized, was not a static concept. It required continuous attention, observation, and reinforcement. Discretion was not simply about secrecy. It was about understanding the weight of responsibility and the consequences of actions. Leadership involved balancing empathy with decisiveness, observation with action, and fairness with firmness. The palace, as a microcosm of governance and human interaction, had tested these principles, and William had emerged confident in his approach. He also considered the personal growth that had come from the experience. Leadership demanded reflection, patience, and a commitment to doing what was right, even when difficult. By observing carefully, gathering evidence, and acting decisively, he had maintained the integrity of the household while demonstrating fairness and respect. The experience had strengthened his skills as a leader, deepened his understanding of human behavior, and reinforced the values that would guide him in the future. As the week drew to a close, the palace continued to operate with calm efficiency. Staff members, aware of the recent events and their resolution, moved with renewed purpose and confidence. William's careful handling of the situation had left a lasting impression, reinforcing the principles of loyalty, discretion, and responsibility. The household had not only weathered the challenge but had emerged stronger, with a clearer understanding of the standards expected and the trust required to maintain harmony. In the quiet of Kensington Palace, as lights dimmed and the day came to an end, William allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The breach had been addressed, trust restored, and the household reminded of the importance of integrity. Leadership had been tested, challenges faced, and principles upheld. The palace continued to function smoothly, guided by values that transcended individual actions and emphasized the collective responsibility of everyone within its walls. And so the royal household moved forward, stronger and more vigilant. Prince William's careful observation, decisive action, and thoughtful reflection had ensured that the palace remained a place of trust, order, and professionalism. The lessons of the experience, loyalty, discretion, integrity, and fairness, would continue to guide the household, ensuring that its operations remained secure and its staff confident. The events of the past week became not just a story of accountability, but a lasting example of principled leadership, resilience, and the importance of trust in every corner of the palace.